Hi, I'm Doug Boynton, and you're listening to WHRO's Weekly Edition, where we highlight the week's news and stories happening in our area. As we settle into May, here are the week's big stories. The Virginia Beach School Board upheld an earlier vote to disband diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. Dominion Energy is facing new problems due to looming tariffs. Its offshore wind project could increase by $500 million.
If current tariff policy were to continue through the end of 2026, when the project is expected to fully enter service, cumulative tariff impact would be expected to be approximately $500 million.
And funding for Virginia museums and libraries could be under threat by the Trump administration's government cuts. We'll dig into these stories and more, but first, this news update from NPR. Welcome back to WHRO's Weekly Edition. We start this week in the city of Norfolk, which recently created a Mayor's Commission on Housing. WHRO's Ryan Murphy checks in on the story to explain what that is and what it intends to do.
Norfolk Mayor Kenny Alexander says the housing study completed by a consultant last year included strategies to tackle the city's housing woes. But he says it didn't answer key questions about how to actually get that done.
Who's going to quarterback this? Before that, no one was named to quarterback it.
Alexander says the commission will be tasked with crafting action plans to address the city's housing problems and figuring out which city departments, agencies, or public-private partnerships should take the reins. The mayor also wants to see specifics about how Norfolk should approach major development efforts like those at Military Circle and in St. Paul's Quadrant near downtown. Ryan Murphy, WHRO News.
In Virginia Beach, the school board voted Tuesday to uphold an earlier vote that dismantled diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. WHRO's Sienna Morales details how it affects the district moving forward.
The school board voted April 8th to comply with President Donald Trump's executive order that threatened to withhold funding from schools with DEI programs. Some board members voted against the resolution, then called an emergency meeting after federal courts cited First Amendment concerns and blocked enforcement of the order.
This impacts our local kids. Kids are asking, what programs are impacted? We don't know. If we make a guess and we make the wrong guess, that steps on their First Amendment rights.
That's board member Matt Cummings. After Tuesday's motion failed in a 5-5 vote, the school board will go ahead with enacting the April vote dismantling DEI. Sienna Morales, WHRO News.
We should mention Virginia Beach City Public Schools are stakeholders in Heretta, which holds the license to the WHRO stations. Some big news from the Virginia Aquarium. Hooked turtle season has started. If you're wondering what that's all about, WHRO's Catherine Hafner is here to tell us more.
Young sea turtles swim up the Virginia coast this time of year, and they're hungry after wintering in areas with less food. Bait on fishing hooks looks like a free meal, and turtles often bite and get seriously injured. Scientist Susan Barco previously told WHRO that hotspots include the fishing piers at Buckrow in Hampton and Norfolk's Ocean View.
Kind of like a little buffet out there for these guys, and so the likelihood of encountering a hook in that area is much higher than anywhere else.
Removing the hooks can be a complicated surgical process. Separately, the aquarium saw a record number of sea turtles this past winter suffering from a condition called cold stun, when the creatures are weakened by a sudden drop in water temperature. Catherine Hafner, WHRO News.
If you see a turtle in distress, call the aquarium's stranding response team at 757-385-7575. That's 757-385-7575. A North Carolina state senator recently introduced a bill to ban balloon releases in North Carolina. Wildlife and environmental groups applaud the move. Public Radio East's Annette Weston has more.
Currituck County State Senator Bobby Hennig's Senate Bill 20 would make the intentional release of balloons illegal with a fine of $250 per balloon for violations. Supporters say that balloon releases harm the state's scenic beauty and pose a danger to wildlife and marine animals. Hennig first introduced the bill in last year's short session, but the Senate didn't act on it. He reintroduced it early this year. Debbie Swick is the founder of Banned Balloon Releases NC and is behind the effort to impose a statewide ban.
They release them for weddings, graduations, gender reveals, and sadly for memorials.
The Outer Banks woman started the organization after seeing a balloon release on TV in 2023.
It was for a young lady that had passed away in Virginia. They let go hundreds of pink and yellow balloons against the North Carolinian blue sky, and it just moved me. It bothered me. It stirred something in me. I started to sob uncontrollably, so I knew I had to pay attention. Something was telling me to pay attention to this issue.
Initially, Swick worked to get local governments to ban mass balloon releases and was in touch with leaders of all of the state's 100 counties.
Some counties, had a resounding support, but, they had to vote on it. Some counties said, well, it's not in our area. We don't really see balloons. And so it was quite a mission for the past year.
But Swick said balloons don't have to be released on the beach to have an impact on ocean creatures.
A helium balloon, when it's released, travels an average of 1,300 miles. So any balloon released east of the Mississippi River has the potential of landing in the Atlantic Ocean.
North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences mammalogy research curator Dr. Michael Cove said discarded balloons floating in the ocean look like prey that many majestic ocean creatures eat, like squid or jellyfish.
These balloons, once they're kind of floating out there in the open water, they tend to look similar, very similar, to a lot of the prey items to so many of our cetaceans, whales and dolphins.
In November 2023, a live Gervais beaked whale washed up in Emerald Isle and died soon after, and Cove said it died from swallowing a balloon. Samantha Kropp is the Neuse River Keeper and Sound River's Director of Advocacy, and she said the issue of balloon releases is a statewide problem, and it doesn't just impact coastal North Carolina. One of the organization's projects involves placing trash traps in ENC rivers and streams.
The whole point of the trash traps is to passively intercept litter as it makes its way from our streets and sidewalks and rooftops and other impervious surfaces into creeks, and to intercept it before it gets to the sound and before it gets to the ocean.
Kropp said 95% of the trash that ends up in those traps is plastic.
Plastics are breaking down into microplastics, and when we looked at microplastics, the majority of those were coming from things like polyethylenes, so things like bags, films, and containers. Balloons are a part of that largest category of what we're seeing in the form of microplastics that, of course, come from macroplastics.
Of opposition to the proposed balloon release ban, Banned Balloon Releases NC founder Swick said that she sometimes hears it's a tradition held dear for many, particularly after a loved one's death.
Balloons don't go to heaven. And I can say that with the utmost conviction in my heart. They do not go to heaven. They do wind up coming back down to Earth, whether they've exploded at the atmospheric level or they just drift into the ocean and then get blown back, whatever the case is.
The bill is currently in the Rules and Operations Committee of the Senate. It includes a few limited exceptions, like balloons released for scientific or meteorological purposes and hot air balloons that are recovered. In eastern North Carolina, I'm Annette Weston, Public Radio East.
Still ahead on Weekly Edition, a Hampton Roads recycling company is accepting more items in an effort to increase the practice. But first, Dominion Energy says new tariffs could raise the cost of its offshore wind project by $500 million. WHRO's Catherine Hafner reports on how that could affect the company and perhaps the utility's customers, too.
Dominion is halfway through building the wind farm about 30 miles off the Virginia Beach coast. It's currently planned to cost $10.8 billion. The Trump administration's taxes on imported goods now threaten to raise the price tag. Dominion CEO Bob Blue told investors Thursday that tariffs have already added $4 million to the project. And
if current tariff policy were to continue through the end of 2026, when the project is expected to fully enter service, cumulative tariff impact would be expected to be approximately $500 million.
Dominion says Virginians will also pay about 43 more cents on their monthly energy bills because of rising costs aside from tariffs. The Virginia Beach wind farm is one of only a handful under construction on the East Coast, despite President Trump's efforts to halt the industry. Catherine Hafner, WHRO News.
Denmark's ambassador spoke in Norfolk last week about the need for strong alliances as the Trump administration calls to annex Greenland. WHRO military reporter Steve Walsh was there.
Ambassador Jasper Moller Sorensen says he continues to remind the administration that Denmark was an original NATO ally, even as the U.S. talks of annexing Greenland, which has ties to Denmark.
It is exceedingly important to remember, now we talk about security in the Arctic around Greenland, that we have a defense agreement with the United States since 1951 that provides the U.S. access and can operate military bases.
The ambassador spoke before the World Affairs Council of Hampton Roads at the Norfolk Yacht Club, along with representatives from Finland and Estonia, as part of the NATO festival. Steve Walsh, WHRO News.
Funding for cultural institutions in Virginia may be under threat after the Institute of Museum and Library Services was targeted by President Trump's government efficiency cuts. WHRO's Sienna Morales digs into the effect it would have on local facilities.
The IMLS is an independent federal agency founded to preserve access to the information stored in America's cultural institutions. A federal judge granted a temporary restraining order Thursday to block the agency's dismantling. However, the future of funding is still uncertain. The IMLS awarded $9.7 million in Virginia last year, including roughly $1.4 million to Old Dominion University.
It is one of the most efficiently run places you can imagine. The money was well used by us, and I think we multiplied the benefits to our community.
That's Eric Neal, director of the Chrysler Museum of Art. Neal said the Chrysler used an IMLS grant to establish its Good Works on Paper Center to preserve prints and photographs. Sienna Morales, WHRO News.
Rabbits are prolific, but their babies are at risk this time of year. Hundreds of them end up at the Wildlife Center of Virginia in Waynesboro every spring. Sandy Hausman from partner station WVTF reports on how to tell when young rabbits are in need of care and what you can do to help.
Spring is baby time at the Wildlife Center of Virginia, and the most common patient is a rabbit, maybe attacked by a cat or discovered in a nest disturbed by a lawnmower. People often wonder what they can do, and spokesman Connor Gillespie offers this advice.
Cottontails are a very high-stress species, so anytime that they're captured and brought into care, that's a lot of stress for them, and that can be very harmful. So we want to make sure that we're only doing that if they truly need our help.
Call the center and you'll be asked if the animal is injured. If not, experts often advise putting babies back in their nest and doing a tic-tac-toe test.
So you take some sticks, you put it in a tic-tac-toe pattern over that nest after you put the bunny back, and then check the next morning. If those sticks have been moved aside, then that means the mother has come to that nest site and cared for them. If those sticks are still in place, then that's more concerning because it sounds like she's not coming back, and then we want them to maybe come in for care.
Some people think they're helping by moving a nest to a more secluded spot, but Gillespie says that's a mistake.
If they're not harmed at all, it's best to kind of leave them right there in the nest. The mother is very secretive, so you might not see her come back, but she'll come back at dawn and dusk is the time she'll come back to feed the young.
Because the center has so many baby bunnies, he adds there's a great need for wild greens, and donations of dandelions are gladly accepted at the center in Waynesboro. I'm Sandy Hausman.
A local recycling company says it upgraded its technology to accept more paper items such as your coffee cup. WHRO's Catherine Hafner reports on how that might affect the industry.
TFC Recycling handles curbside service for much of Hampton Roads. The company says it can only recycle paper, cans, and plastic or glass bottles. Paper previously meant things like bags, cardboard, and milk cartons. Now you can add paper cups and containers to the list, like those that hold coffee, soda, or soup. Just make sure they're dry and the lids are discarded. TFC used a grant from food packaging groups to install new sorting machinery at its Chesapeake plant, which is boosted by artificial intelligence. Plastic cups are still not accepted, only bottles and jugs. Catherine Hafner, WHRO News.
This is WHRO's Weekly Edition. Remember, for any stories you've missed, you can visit us on the WHRO smartphone app or all social media platforms.
Millions of dollars in previously awarded federal grants intended for cultural groups across the country have been canceled by the Trump administration. Among the affected organizations are state humanities councils, including Virginia Humanities, which produces the radio show With Good Reason and other history and arts programs. WMRA's Meredith McCool reports for partner station WMRA.
On a warm spring afternoon, the garden at the Ann Spencer House is lush with greenery and birdsong. Nestled along Lynchburg's Pierce Street Renaissance Historic District, the home features the restored gardens of the Harlem Renaissance poet Ann Spencer. Since the 1970s, the preservation of the house and its grounds has been supported in part by Virginia Humanities. According to Virginia Humanities Executive Director Matthew Gibson, the Ann Spencer House and Garden Museum is one of the many cultural institutions across the Commonwealth that have flourished thanks to funding from his organization.
The work that we do is to support the preservation, documentation, and stories about all of us as Virginians. Those stories help us to connect to one another across our many divides, to see one another as human beings without the sort of boxes and labels that, our society always wants to try to put people into.
Now, their ability to do that work faces a significant funding challenge. On April 3rd, Gibson was notified that $1.35 million in general operating support awarded by the National Endowment for the Humanities, or NEH, was terminated.
When I got an email at 12:51 a.m. on April 3rd allegedly from NEH, but it was really from the Department of Government Efficiency, because it actually came from a Microsoft.com email address, not a NEH.gov email address, terminating our current grant. That was a real surprise. I think we had always assumed that the active grant we had this year would be up for a political discussion, which is typically how a budget gets created in Congress. It's a political process. The White House proposes and Congress disposes. And we thought that the FY26 budget was going to be the one that we were going to have to focus our sights on. As far as the practical impact on us, we are going to have to lay off staff and curb some of our programs, maybe even get rid of a couple of our programs.
Gibson said that the organization will survive thanks to support from the state, corporate foundations, and private individuals, but they will have to make significant reductions. He added that, as hard as the cuts are for the NEH and Virginia Humanities,
it's going to be really hard for Virginians.
He shared that Virginia Humanities provides close to $1 million a year in support that's locally directed, organized, and controlled in the form of grants to rural and urban organizations such as historical societies, museums, and libraries. Those organizations engage local communities in educational topics about issues that are relevant for those particular communities. For example,
there's a place in Lynchburg called Pierce Street, which was this sort of bastion of sort of an American Renaissance, sort of an African-American Renaissance. You had poet Ann Spencer there. You had Chauncey Spencer, her son, who was one of the Tuskegee Airmen. You had Arthur Ashe and Althea Gibson learning how to play tennis on the same block. I mean, it's an incredible place, right? And I think about what would happen if we divest both from the federal level, but the trickle-down divestment that comes from that initial divestment. If we do that, what happens to the communities like that?
For instance, Virginia Humanities was pivotal in the creation of a virtual tour of the Ann Spencer House and Garden Museum, which is available through Encyclopedia Virginia. The virtual tour opens up the entire property to those with limited mobility, as the second floor of the 1903-built home is only physically accessible by stairs. Currently on Pierce Street, Shawn Spencer Hester, Ann Spencer's granddaughter and the director of the museum, is hard at work tending the garden and constructing an adjacent event space. She told WMRA that, in order to preserve her grandmother's beloved refuge, sources of revenue beyond grant funding will be a necessity. Nevertheless, she has plans to apply for a Virginia Humanities grant to support the creation of a new museum brochure. Despite the challenges, Matthew Gibson has hope.
What gives me hope is these people, the people that we work with every day, whether it's in urban, suburban, or rural communities, they're just incredible people. They're not the faces of the left or the right. They're people. They're Virginians. I think that's what gives me hope.
The NEH did not respond to WMRA's request for comment. I'm Meredith McCool.
And a note of transparency, the Virginia Center for Investigative Journalism at WHRO has received grants from Virginia Humanities in the past, and WHRO Public Media is home to the organization's new Regional Humanities Center. Virginia Humanities has no involvement in the newsroom's editorial decisions. Virginia's General Assembly session has officially drawn to a close after Governor Glenn Youngkin issued his final vetoes last week. WHRO's Catherine Hafner reports on which environmental legislation survived.
New laws taking effect in July will create a task force to protect wetlands, require plant stores to label invasive species, and allow tribes to access flood preparedness grants. One law launches a pilot program for what officials call virtual or community power plants. The idea is to let utilities tap into the combined power of household energy resources.
Imagine the smart thermostats they have, water heaters, heat pumps, electric vehicles, solar, all have the capacity to put power back on the grid.
That's Norfolk delegate and bill sponsor Phil Hernandez, speaking to fellow lawmakers earlier this year. More than a dozen other environmental bills passed the legislature but were vetoed by Governor Youngkin. Those include an electric vehicle infrastructure fund for rural areas, an offshore wind workforce training program, and an effort to make data center developers disclose impacts on the surrounding community. Catherine Hafner, WHRO News.
And the governor again vetoed legislation Virginia Democrats say would protect abortion access from future U.S. Supreme Court action. Republicans feared it would open up doctors to legal liability, but the bill's authors disagree. WVTF's Brad Kuttner breaks that down.
Senator Ghazala Hashmi told Radio IQ Monday that in the wake of the U.S. Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade, states need to protect contraception in case federal protections are struck. But Governor Glenn Youngkin disagreed. In his veto statement of Hashmi's bill, he said it could, quote, subject parents, political subdivisions, and medical professionals to litigation even when acting within their legal rights and professional bounds. It's the same point Senator David Soderline, who said he otherwise supports a right to contraception, made on the Senate floor when the bill was debated during the 2025 session.
And that might be very exciting for attorneys, but that's not actually what we're trying to do on contraceptives.
But Hashmi said the bill does the opposite, pointing to the language in the measure that subjects localities and the state itself to legal liability for limiting contraception access, not doctors.
This legislation protects medical professionals from facing lawsuits. Should the repeal on the right to contraception go into effect federally?
This is the second time such an effort made it to the governor's desk. Hashmi said she'd bring it again next year once Youngkin was out of office. Democratic gubernatorial candidate Abigail Spanberger tells Radio IQ she'd sign it. Republican candidate Winsome Earl Sears did not offer comment following the veto, but voted against the bill during the session. In Richmond, I'm Brad Kuttner.
And that's a wrap. You've been listening to WHRO's Weekly Edition. We had help today from WHRO's Steve Walsh, Catherine Hafner, Sienna Morales, Nick McNamara, and Ryan Murphy. WMRA's Meredith McCool, WVTF's Sandy Hausman, Michael Pope, and Brad Kuttner. Also Public Radio East's Annette Weston, and thanks as always to Connor Worley, who produced today's show. A reminder, you can always catch full episodes on the Weekly Edition podcast feed. You can get your news updates at WHRO.org, the WHRO smartphone app, and the WHRO Reports podcast feed. For all of us at WHRO and WHRV, I'm Doug Boynton. Stay safe. Be well.